This is the process of many years of policy decisions, and moreover, it isn't going to be over swiftly.
There are people who responded to the riots in Southport last summer with a sense that something was coming to a head.
We are probably past the tipping point.
We have not had civil conflict in this country since the 17th century.
When this story is written up, it will be determined that essentially the ingredients and the processes were all working in a time which is now in our historic past.
To give us a kind of overview of why you make this prediction that civil war is coming to Britain, what are the signs that in other countries have been the forebearers of civil war, and what are you seeing in British society now that suggests we are living in a similarly precarious moment?
The Civil War's literature, with respect to its understanding of the causation of this thing, can be summarized, I think, reasonably fairly around the following 3 points. Factionalism is terribly dangerous. The particular sort of factionalism which is most dangerous is known as polar factionalism. Polar factionalism is where people are no longer disagreeing over particular issues per se, whether it might be feminism or abortion or death penalty or the like, where people have views on things that can be very strong, but they're differing on the basis of what they perceive to be the consensus view within their tribe, rather than on the issue per se. We are now in a state of polar, we in Britain, but not exclusively in Britain, I might say, in a state not just of factionalization, but of polar factionalization. Another distinctly important cause of civil wars in the estimation of the people who study and write about them is this concept of downgrading. Downgrading is a term which is effectively the academic way of describing the replacement narrative. It describes a situation in which a formerly dominant majority is losing its status or fears that it is losing its status in that society, in its own homeland, which is a very dangerous situation because formerly dominant majority or a majority which is fearing the loss of its position still has the wherewithal to form a mass movement and is highly incentivized also to action. So it's generally considered to be a very significant factor in the emergence of civil wars. A third element of causation is the loss of faith. Loss of faith specifically in the legitimacy, in the perceived legitimacy of normal politics. When people start to say, for example, that politics doesn't work or politics is broken, or to be sort of academic about it, that politics is no longer functioning as a solution to collective action problems. These are expressions of perception of a lack of legitimacy in that system. Legitimacy is a very important idea when you talk about insurgency and specifically counterinsurgency. You encounter this term legitimacy almost as often as you encounter cracks in the sidewalk when you're out walking your dog. It just comes up with great regularity. It's very hard to define adequately. It really comes down to a kind of magic of government. You know, when you have legitimacy, your costs of government are low. When you don't have legitimacy, your costs of government are high. One way of measuring it, I suggest, as a proxy, is by measuring trust. Trust is a thing which is very well measured and consistently measured in social science for a very long time. In the West, trust has been in decline, not just recently, but essentially over a generation, longer than a generation, in fact. And now is at something of a nadir. I mean, in the sense that you can't get much lower than a single digit, which is where the estimation now of the British public in terms of their trust in political institutions, political parties, and the like, it is somewhere between 9 and 11%. I mean, it's literally hovering at double digit. All of these things are agreed upon. Generally, the civil wars, people who study civil wars are concerned with wars in hot, dusty places, in places far removed from this. Although most of people in the subject area do acknowledge there's nothing biblical about the West that makes it, immune to this problem, and a handful of actually the most eminent people in the field have mentioned in passing in works on civil wars in other places that, dear West, don't think that this doesn't apply to you. Okay. Generally, the bulwarks against civil war are, again, let's just go with three. Right. One is wealth. Wealth is tremendously important. In fact, if people are forced to give just one reason, they usually just say, well, rich societies, if there's a lot of money in a given social system, then even if there are cracks, there are fractures, there are tensions within that society, money can lubricate or paper over or otherwise ameliorate those conflicts. That bulwark, I think I don't claim to be an economist, but I don't think it's particularly controversial to suggest that with respect to the economic potential of continuing to service that model of domestic turmoil prevention through essentially debt financing is coming to an end. That's even if we don't get a repeat of another 2008 scale shock, which is frankly pretty likely also. That is my gut feeling. So wealth is definitely a factor that tends to mitigate against the potential for civil war. But the assumption that wealth is going to continue to perform that role in Britain and in other countries is one that it is at the very least debatable by objective people. Another factor which is considered to be a bulwark against civil wars is a kind of culture or habit of obedience. After a certain number of generations of good government, people are just acculturated to doing the right thing, right? It gets a kind of patterned behavior. This can be sometimes over-exaggerated, but I feel it's a common argument, especially in the British context, sometimes in a disparaging way when British people are referred to as kind of relatively speaking more passive than others, relatively speaking more likely to endure offenses deriving either from various sources, but specifically offenses deriving from its power elite.
It happens to Canadians as well, your people.
Canadians, right. Anyway, Canadians, probably Australians, anywhere where you get essentially that has in the DNA of their governmental model, the British model. I like to suggest sometimes that the British are like a bit like the Prussians. The Prussians try to figure out, the Prussians are very impressed by Napoleon as a genius, as a kind of god of war. And they say, how can we make a system that makes lots of Napoleons, right? So we want to be able to fight wars as well as Napoleon without relying on the natural occurrence of military geniuses. So they come up with the Prussian model of running a military. Sometimes I like to suggest that British kind of did this for governance. The British had a kind of genius for governance that informs a kind of long-standing habit of tradition. Here I would suggest, or a habit of obedience. Here I would suggest, though, that also there are reasons to believe that this habit is attenuating and has been substantially eroded. The major, overt feature of this British genius for governance is essentially a unified and competent elite. It's not that the British actually, as a people, have a lesser kind of genetic tendency to revolt than other people. It is, though, I think actually there is a tendency, at least as equal tendency to revolt, but the British power elite historically over at least the last 2 centuries has been quite unified and quite competent in how it deals with these things. So co-optation it has traditionally been very sophisticated in the British model. Also, the British Army, in its role as the aid to the civil power, is very well established and pretty handy at that sort of function. So British governance has been pretty good at staying unified in the face of threat, and also pretty competent in its use of power, even under conditions of stress. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that one might question the general level of competence amongst the power elite today. So I won't dwell on that, but rather focus a bit on the unified aspect. And here I think it is also difficult to describe our current power elite as unified. we're already seeing elite defections, mostly on the right. It must be said, though occasionally on the left. The best example of elite defection in our world today is not British; it's Donald Trump. But the pattern itself of what elite defection, I think, is more and more apparent. You were just remarking about how many new movements were established just at the beginning of this week.
Just two more on Monday.
I would interpret this as sign essentially of the elite essentially beginning to fracture. If you think of unity as like an expression, hey, we're all in the same boat. Okay, we disagree. You're Ed Balls. I'm George Osborne. We can have a mano a mano discussion about things because essentially we understand we're in the same boat. That is unusual, increasingly unusual in this context, which is better defined as basically people are looking for lifeboats, their own lifeboats. The third thing to consider is one that relates to the former two, and that is the emergence of expectation gaps. In the literature on revolution, civil wars, and the whole kind of social uprising and the like, more or less there is solid agreement ever since Ted Gurr wrote about this like 40 years ago that expectation gaps are problematic. There's debate over how exactly it works. But essentially, when there is a large difference between what people expect to receive, primarily in material benefits, but not solely in material benefits, prestige and like also factor in. When they have a strong expectation of one thing and what they receive is another, and there's a big difference in between them, that is a dangerous situation. It's an expectation gap which tends, so the literature suggests, to lead to turmoil. I think at our current moment, for reasons that are perfectly obvious, I mean, there's a big, shiny, bright light pointed at me, so I can't adequately judge the age of the room, but I do see some young people. Again, it's not a controversial statement to say that there is a very obvious difference in the mood of the young population as opposed to the older population with respect to their ability to do things that were normally expected of the middle classes not so long ago, literally of your own parents, or in fact of people who might just be like 10 or 15 years older than you.
You mean here about owning a house?
Home ownership, right? And everything having that children. Flows from it's home ownership, rate of savings at equivalent age is significantly different, and everything that flows from that. So if you don't have any money and you don't own a home and you're living in a bedsit, then you're relatively unlikely to get married and start to produce children, and unless we go back to the 19th century and you're keeping the babies under the bed. We have a society which is now producing expectation gaps. And moreover, there's every reason to suspect, I would suggest going further, and we'll probably get into it, that expectation gap is going to accelerate pretty damn quick on account of technological changes which are about to do to the white-collar sector what industrial offshoring did to the blue-collar sector 25 years ago already, 30 years ago. Who are these people? Those are your insurgent leaders, basically. That's what Peter Turchin, I think, who's spoken here before, has described as a situation of elite overproduction, where you get a cadre of people who have been trained and acculturated to expect they were going to join the elite, which have that ambition thwarted. That number of people might, according to the most recent, be about 39% of that.
When I interviewed Peter Turchin here a little while ago, he was already mapping out this territory and the gap in expectations that you're describing. As of just, I think, the beginning of this week, there was an article in the Financial Times reporting that the number of new starter jobs in the UK has shrunk by more than 30% since the introduction of ChatGPT. The AI jobs catastrophe is here. And it's not unreasonable to assume that there will be a great many disaffected, indebted, and potentially quite restive young people out there.
So in short, there are three good reasons to think that this is coming, and there are three good reasons to think that it might, all things being equal, be resisted, but all things are not equal because those things are not as operative now or plausibly in the near future as they have been in the past.
May I ask for a clarification?
Yes.
When we say civil war, what do we mean? For a non-war studies normie over here, what do we mean when we say civil war?
So I use the term civil war in a very specific sense. And I know if there are academics in the room, of course, there are many definitions of civil war, and we could spend a long time talking about that. I use the term civil war in this sense. It is to refer to a form of war in which the belligerents, two or more, or all belligerents, two or more, were under the same sovereign authority at the outset of the conflict. That's essentially the as far as what I mean by civil war from a definitional perspective.
In this situation, I assume you do not mean two neighbours, though, arguing over a fence.
No, I'm not trying to reduce it down to that level, although quite that level. Fundamentally, I'm trying to do a few things. Firstly, I don't want to call it just a war because I want to highlight the internal origin of it. It's not it's not external in its origin. I also don't want to euphemize war by calling it struggle, conflict. Actually, I slightly have in previous, I talked about turmoil and whatever, calamity. But I want to keep the word war in there because I'm a war studies professor, and that's my inclination. I also think it's correct. But to highlight its civil nature. Now, of course, if one takes that definition, yes, there is a very wide range of flavors of civil war you might call it, whether it's in contemporary times, from one region to another, from one country to another. It'll look different, take different forms, and from one historical period to another. I might have used other terms and occasionally lapse into the use of other terms like revolution or rebellion or uprising, and there are qualities of it which I do believe might otherwise merit that term. But I wanted to talk about civil war because, at least to my mind, when one talks about revolution or rebellion, it implies something spasmodic and explosive, right? So that it triggers, it has a massive effect, but then it's over, okay? Whereas, and I think that in the context of the discussion I'd like to have, or what I want to say to people, that it's not like that. It's not quite like an explosive thing. It's not an event. It is a process that has a long prehistory. We didn't get to the situation that I just described as being in the sweet spot for civil war causation immediately. This is the process of many years of policy decisions, and moreover, it isn't going to be over swiftly. This is one of the very well-established characteristics of civil wars, is they tend to be longer.
Let's take a moment then to pause before we get into
That's what I mean.
the conception of the war itself, and start with these kind of conditions that David's laid out. Mary, I want to hear your response to it. Do you resonate with that characterization of the conditions that are currently set up in this country, and do you feel they are as much on a knife edge as David portrays them to be?
I suspect this is one of those questions which will be answered very differently depending on where you're sitting. So, for example, I can think of a great many older homeowners who live in pleasant parts of London or the southeast who would be honestly just bewildered by the story that David is telling. I can also imagine that there are residents of, say, Croydon or Dagenham who might scratch their heads and think, maybe. And there are people who responded to the riots in Southport last summer with a sense that something was coming to a head. My gut feeling is that the principal scissor is age and class, but also the principal scissors are age and class, and that really this cuts across both left and right. Because in my observation, it is much more common, even on the right, to be hopeful that we can resolve our differences, come together, find a new settlement, reintegrate Britain, British values, etc., and so on. For those people who grew up in the 1990s when the world, when things really could only get better, or so we were told. Whereas I think for example, for those of my acquaintances who went to university, or rather didn't go to university during COVID, and who've come out into a very different employment landscape, a very different housing landscape, and a very different economy, and who are perhaps staring down the barrel of ChatGPT eating their job, may feel quite differently about it. and may experience some of the pressures which are currently bearing down on the more precariously situated people in this country, may experience those pressures much more directly and feel much more willing to consider any option as in response to that. You could probably put disparate people from different socioeconomic groups together in the room, and they would disagree violently on how plausible it is. I honestly don't know where the balance of the energy lies. I mean, where I live in small town England, it just doesn't feel plausible. But then I compare notes with friends who live in quite different parts of the country, and when I hear what they say, it does.
Does disagreement about the plausibility of a civil war actually decrease the likelihood of a civil war? Does that make no difference? If people think it can't happen to them, does that actually make it less likely that they would join in should something happen? Or is that actually just wishful thinking?
I don't know is the answer to that. I'm not sure how I would, as a scholar, I don't know how I would answer that. My gut feeling, though, since you've asked me the question, I'm sitting in front of the room, is that it doesn't matter and potentially makes it worse in the sense that the people who are most volatile are usually those whose delusions have been shattered in the most dramatic way. So if you're in denial about a thing and then it occurs to you, you tend to get the most powerful counter reaction. And so I fear that a population which is kind of burbling along thinking that it's all hunky-dory, that when finally faced with the reality, what's the scholarly term for freaks out?
I mean, arguing against myself and in favour of David's point for a moment, I take an interest in 17th century politics because it seems to me at times that we're in the middle of running the 17th century backwards, which would in itself support your thesis. Because of what happened in 1649. But I remember I was reading...
What did happen in 1649 to those of us who didn't do great in the history GCSE?
The English Civil War happened in 1640. We have not had civil conflict in this country since the 17th century. I was sort of rummaging around in the history books about that period recently, and none of them could agree on what set it off. And none of them could agree really on when precisely it even started. And it's clear if you read it, if you read about it, that there were all the way through. There were areas of the country which wanted to stay neutral. There were whole factions that didn't really know what side they ought to be on, and that it was incredibly mixed and patchwork. And actually incredibly chaotic.
One of the things that you just mentioned about this discussion in the academic literature as to when did this thing actually start? Right? And indeed, when did it end? It seems to be very typical of civil wars and of irregular wars in general. For the most part, you don't have start dates for them. They're more sometimes they're more in the nature of a chronic illness, which kind of flare up at times and they go into remission. For other times, civil war emerges, and so people in the time of that say, oh my God, okay, now we're at war. And then historians afterwards look back and say, well, the tipping point was actually some period before. So normally when you read a book, say, if you read a big academic book on the American Civil War, it's not going to start with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, although that was the kind of oh shit moment where everybody said, well, yes, we're at war now. I mean, they're going to start, there might be 10 chapters before you get to the point where people are actually shooting at each other, kneecapping each other, and doing all of the other obvious stuff that says you're at war.
Civil war is something you realize you're in. You don't have a moment.
In other words, there is a tipping point. The tipping point has occurred before you realize I'm rolling downhill, or for Americans, if you're in Wile E. Coyote, Roadrunner cartoon, and Wile E. Coyote is run off the cliff, and there's always like a 2-second pregnant moment where it halts before gravity. Okay, so he's gone over the tipping point.
Just in the context of Britain now, would Wile E. Coyote be in the air?
I feel we've passed the tipping point already. We are probably past the tipping point. When this story is written up, it will be determined that essentially the ingredients and the processes were all working in a time which is now in our historic past.